prime minister signs nothing, and yet tens of billions move. In a city-state where one wrong call can jolt the currency and the jobs of millions, Hsien Loong sits atop a vault most countries can't imagine, without being allowed to open it alone. So the immediate question is simple and sharp. How do you run one of the world's richest states without blurring public money and private life when the pressure spikes, and whose hand actually holds the key when it does? This vault didn't appear by luck. Picture the 1970s harbor cranes swinging over Jurong, cash from land sales and early surpluses salted away instead of spent. And a tidy habit. The central bank piled up foreign reserves, while the government created professional arms to manage assets. Temasek, formed in 1974, took the state's stakes in companies and ran them commercially. GIC, set up in 1981, invested long-term government funds globally. MAS guarded liquidity and the currency. The pool grew because it had jobs, not slogans. But the bigger it got, the more the next question mattered. With that scale, who can touch it and under what rules? Here's the lock. Singapore's constitution draws a bright line called the past reserves, assets built up before the current term of government, and no one can dip into that line without the elected president's assent. Year to year, the budget can use up to half of the expected long-term returns from investing those reserves through the NIRC, the Net Investment Returns Contribution, which shows up as a clear line item that now funds a big slice of public spending. The day-to-day investing is fenced off. Independent boards at GIC, Temasek, and MAS, an auditor general, and parliamentary scrutiny sit between politicians and stock picks. Add a cultural padlock, high, transparent ministerial pay, and a ministerial code that demands declaration of interests and recusal when conflicts arise. If that kind of clean breakdown of who can do what helps cut through the noise, hit like so this explainer finds the folks who will be asking hard questions the next time the alarm rings. Paper rules are tidy, but they only get judged when someone asks to break the glass. So what happens when the government needs to tap the past reserves in a real storm? Watch one play out. In 2009, the global financial crisis hit like a cold wave. The finance minister stood at a wooden lectern with a brown briefcase and asked to draw a few billion from the past reserves for a resilience package. The president, after consulting an advisory council, gave his assent, and the draw was later replenished when the economy snapped back, an important precedent that said the vault could open in a pinch and close again after. But that was a small hole in the dam. A decade later, every plane seat went empty, and the numbers on the table were an order of magnitude larger. In 2020, masks hid faces on the MRT, and Changi's departure boards froze. Lee went on national TV at night, voice steady, and the government sought presidential approval to use tens of billions from the past reserves to backstop wages, keep firms alive, and fund emergency healthcare. The president's letters of assent were published alongside the budgets, showing the request, the advice from the Council of Presidential Advisors, and the reasons. Parliament debated each package. The NIRC line still sat there doing quiet work, and the drawdowns, spread over 2020 to 2022, were tracked in updates with a promise to rebuild. Money flowing eases panic, but it also sharpens eyes on the man at the top, because the next doubt is always the same. Can his personal world tug at these calls? That's where separation has to feel real, not just printed. In Singapore, the prime minister's pay is pegged high to top private sector earners to cut the temptation and the need to curry favor, while the ministerial code forces declarations of interests and recusals when matters touch close to home. The CPIB, the Anti-Corruption Bureau, can investigate anyone. If an investigation stalls, the president can direct it to proceed, a backstop designed for ugly days. Optics still bite. For years, Temasek's chief executive was Lee's wife, Ho Ching, which meant decisions around Temasek's shareholder matters were handled by the finance minister. Temasek's board operated independently, and Lee would recuse. You can picture the choreography, a Temasek folder on a table, one chair left empty as another minister takes the brief. Those steps lower the risk, but they don't erase suspicion in a small place where everyone knows everyone, and suspicion only gets louder when markets turn south. Which brings us to the next unknown. The next big test won't arrive with labels. Maybe it's a global inflation shock that shreds currency reserves faster than models expect, or a sudden failure in a foreign bank that puts GIC on the front page, or a sharp markdown in a marquee Temasek holding that turns into a political fight. If that day comes, the process is already set. The government must justify a draw in Parliament. The president weighs advice and can say no. The public sees the letters, and markets watch every word for signs of discipline or drift. The real question is whether those guardrails hold when choices get uglier and the personal and political lines blur under floodlights. If you want to be there when we break down that decision in real time, subscribe now so you don't miss the follow-up when Singapore's reserves face their next big test. Because the verdict on this system will come in a week when everyone's hands are shaking. Under those floodlights, another worry always creeps in from the wings: the shadow of personal wealth optics. When your spouse once ran Temasek and you sit near the levers, even clean walls can throw tricky reflections. That's why the system leans hard on conflict of interest rules. Ministers file asset and interest declarations inside government, and when a discussion touches a live conflict, the chair scrapes back and the person leaves the room. Lee has said he recused himself from government matters involving Temasek while Ho Ching led it. But the question that bites isn't whether a form got filed. It's whether those exits happen fast enough, when tempers are up and decisions can't wait. Paper rules are only as strong as the incentives under them, so Singapore tried to move the temptation out of the room. Ministerial pay is set high by global standards and pegged to private sector benchmarks, an unpopular fact that's defended as a firewall against under-the-table income. The ministerial code bars private directorships without approval, demands disclosure and recusal, and says public interest trumps personal ties. The Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau sits ready to bite, with a door it can knock on at the president's office if a prime minister ever tried to block a probe. Add arm's-length management, Temasek and GIC run investments independently of day-to-day politics. MAS guards liquid reserves and supervises finance, and you get a structure that tries to keep hands off the till even when the budget is tight. But discipline charts on paper still have to hold when the sea turns ugly. The budget side is fenced off by formulas for the same reason. The net investment returns contribution feeds in a steady share of long-term returns from GIC, MAS, and Temasek. And the past reserves rule locks the piggy bank so you can't bust it without the president's consent. In calm years, that setup keeps politics from chasing markets. In 2020's storm, it forced everyone to slow down, write to the president, show their math, and get explicit permission before drawing billions. But crises don't always attack through the front gate of the budget. Sometimes the pressure hits through optics in the portfolio. Take one emblem on the glass: Temasek's investment in FTX, written down to zero after the exchange collapsed. You could picture the boardroom thick glass walls, a long table, clipped voices, and the statement that followed: an internal review, accountability, compensation adjustments, no hint the cabinet had steered the bet. It was a painful public loss, and it trained the spotlight back on the firewall. Temasek's autonomy, the shareholder role of the Ministry of Finance, the Prime Minister's recusal when his spouse led the firm. That episode answered one prediction: that politicians would rush in to direct trades, in the negative. But it opened the harder question. When investment optics get ugly, at the same time the government asks to lean on the reserves, does public trust still separate what the market manager decides from what the elected leader approves? That's where succession moves from headline to stress test. Leadership has changed hands. The red box of papers goes to a different set of fingers, and the signatures on those letters to the president switch names. But the institutions are supposed to keep their shape. Continuity of governance means the risk budgets, the investment mandates, the recusal logs, the CPIB's authority, and the NIRC formula all outlast any one man. If the system leads, the personalities rotate around it. Institutional memory helps. The staff who remember how 2009, 2013, and 2020 felt at 2 a.m. But the first time a new prime minister has to step out of a room for a conflict, then step back in to defend a reserves draw under hostile microphones, we'll see if the muscle memory is in the office or only in the person. Because the next shock won't be polite enough to separate lanes. It could be a global downturn that squeezes tax receipts just as markets wobble, making the NIRC cushion feel thinner even before anyone asks to touch the past reserves. Or a geopolitical scrape that hits the very markets GIC and Temasek are exposed to, while the central bank is fighting inflation with one hand and guarding the currency with the other. In that knot, the president's veto power, the finance ministry's shareholder stance, the manager's autonomy, the prime minister's salary and code firewall, and the CPIB's independence all land on the same week, and the whole promise of stewardship gets measured minute by minute against public trust. So we end where the system begins. With restraint you can see when the stakes spike. If the guardrails hold, budgets stay rule-bound, portfolios take their knocks without political steering, and the public accepts that a leader can be powerful without being personally enriched by the state's wealth. If they slip, even a hint of blurred lines, an unclean recusal, a back-channel nudge, a silence where a letter should be, turns a fiscal tool into a political wound. We'll be here when that test comes, breaking down the decisions as they happen. Subscribe if you want to watch whether Singapore's model keeps power and money apart when the next crisis tries to weld them together.